Well, good morning and welcome to our class today. Today I want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. I want to talk a little bit about cybersecurity and what I call the 4 Ds of national defense in the cyber arena. Imagine, if you will, you're sitting at your desk starting off a good day. It's beautiful weather outside, you're coming into a holiday season. You begin to receive phone calls, frantic phone calls from colleagues and friends that are in the company, and they're not able to access their emails, they're not able to access files in their computer system. And you begin to wonder what's going on, because maybe they just didn't log in correctly. But there's too many of these people, and they know what they're doing with computers, so that doesn't really make sense. Then you start receiving some phone calls about that it appears that their computers have been taken over, that their computers have weird screensavers. Now imagine that this happens throughout the entire company that you are responsible for protecting, that you are responsible for the IT to make sure that information technology is used by that company to keep it alive and to keep it making profits. Imagine, if you will, that everything that you have been charged to do, everything that you've been assigned to protect, is now imploding and appears to be no end in sight and very little for you to do. Imagine that. Well, that's what we want to talk about a little bit this morning. You know, in Ecclesiastes, a book in the Old Testament of the Bible, there's a really good adage. And that adage is, so there is nothing new under the sun. And I would suggest that that's correct, except that the speed at which things happen have changed dramatically because of the mobile devices that many of us are using. Even the laptops that we are using these days allow us to reach out around the world at literally the speed of light. I can move money from accounts in Milan to Miami to Moscow to Manila to Mumbai with just a click of a button. And unfortunately, often our minds and certainly our legal processes are not built to keep up with that speed. So I want to suggest that while there's nothing new under the sun, the speed at which things happen has changed, and that requires us to have a whole new mentality about things. You know, the Chinese philosopher general Sun Tzu said that if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the outcome of 100 battles. He also said that if you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will have a loss. And finally, something that most of us don't think about is that if you know neither yourself nor the enemy, you will lose. And notice the way he says these things. The way he says them are very, very positive. There is no doubt at all in the way Sun Tzu talks that these things will happen, that you will win, you will prevail if you know yourself and know your enemy. That puts a real burden on us because our enemy, our adversaries are constantly changing. Technology is upgraded, but also the people behind that technology are constantly upgrading their skill sets. They seem to have unlimited budgets. They don't really, but they seem to, especially when we compare them to our budgets. And that's what we want to talk about also a little bit today, is our attitude and our ability to make sure that we are putting up the best defense possible. And how do we do that? Well, the way I've concocted this, or the way I take a look at it, is what's called the 4D method. That starts out with deterrence. We deter, or we try to prevent somebody from attacking us in the first place. Then we'll deny. We put up firewalls, we have antiviruses, we try to make sure that all of our software and hardware are up to date. That denies people the opportunity to actually attack us. We detect. Once they've breached our defenses, they've come into what I call our house. We find that out. It's kind of like having a burglar alarm on your windows and doors, so that when those doors and windows are breached, we can actually tell it. But also, while they're inside our house, we know where they're moving from place to place. We know what they're looking at. We know what they're doing and where they're going. And then finally, we disrupt. We make sure that they cannot remove files from us. We make sure that we can track them. And finally, we make sure that we can track their money flows that they receive from our stolen property. So deter, deny, detect, and disrupt. Remember the basics of cybersecurity: confidentiality, the availability of our data, and the integrity of our data. If we make sure that we follow through and that we keep that in our mind all the time, we'll be okay. Because now it's just a matter of how do we protect the confidentiality of our data and our systems, our business? How do we protect the availability? And finally, something that we often all overlook is the integrity of our data. We want to make sure that our data isn't changed. Well, let's talk about a data breach. We hear that term a lot in the world today, but what does a data breach mean? Well, data is simply information when it comes right down to it. And what's a breach? Well, I want you to think about that as a loss. So we have an information loss. And it doesn't matter when we use this definition whether it's an internal loss, whether it's an external actor, an external attacker, whether it's simply because the systems failed. Perhaps a server went down. Perhaps our electrical supplies were cut off and our uninterruptible power supplies were not quite as uninterruptible as we thought they were. At any rate, we have a loss of information. We have a loss of confidentiality, perhaps. Perhaps our data was actually released out into what we'll call the wild, out into the world. And it's running rampant now on the dark web and so on. People are using it to reestablish their lives in a fake, stolen identity. Our availability. The data is no longer available because system's down. Well, that's as much of a data breach, a data loss, information loss, as if it was stolen. And then finally, information is altered. So that when we make forecasts, when we make reports, when we do accounting, when people submit vouchers for payment, the information cannot be relied upon. The information is false. It's misleading. And so we make improper business decisions. And we're all affected in this. It doesn't matter whether you're a big company. Remember a couple of years ago we heard about Target, the massive store, chain store. It didn't matter whether we were that big or the small HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning supplier through which that attack was made. It doesn't matter whether we're a big company, small company, a private company, or a publicly held company. Government at all levels, municipalities, villages are just as at risk as the federal or the central government. And finally, something that we don't often think about are non-government organizations, NGOs that help us. This could be hospitals, it could be whatever, but they are at risk also. Understand that it is not the size of the entity, it's the attractiveness of the data that it's holding. It's credit card information, customer information, personal identifying information, personal health information. That's what's important. couple of years ago, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, James Comey, is quoted as saying that there are two types of companies in the world. First are those that have been attacked, and secondly, those that don't know that they've been attacked. And this summarizes very well about how we work in today's world, because it seems as though we are all at risk. And I want to suggest to you that it is valuable for you to keep in mind that we are all at risk. Some of us have already been attacked. Some of us have already had our systems penetrated, having data loss, information changed and altered. It doesn't matter. And then there are those of us who don't understand it at all, and we may have already been attacked. One of the things that I like about cybersecurity, when we speak about these kinds of attacks, I mentioned it earlier, that attacks and the attackers are constantly growing. They're constantly learning new things, they're finding new ways to attack us, and I find that challenging. Do I think it's fun? Well, I don't know how I define fun in that way, but I think it's a challenge that is exciting, and that's one of the reasons why I like this line of work. Remember that breaches are an evolving and multifaceted problem, and any one-dimensional response or attempt to describe them will fail to adequately capture their complexity. That means we, the security people who are trying to protect our companies, our families, our nations, must have a very complex and response that meets all of their complexity and diversity. We must be able to think many, many different ways. But we also need to keep an idea of where we are in the world, where we are in the scheme of things. And we don't often think about this. We think about technical responses. We have a computer in front of us, maybe a keyboard, maybe a laptop, maybe a desktop, and that feeds into a larger system, and that's where we think our responsibility lies. But let's try to think beyond that for right now. In 1648, 370 years ago by now, almost 380 years ago, the Treaty of Westphalia came about after Europe had torn itself apart in a very bloody and long, terrible war. And they came up with some principles that have guided the development of world and international relations since then. The key principles of Westphalia, there's two or three. The Treaty of Westphalia acknowledged the sovereignty of states and the fundamental right to political self-determination. It means that one state is not supposed to go into another state and say, well, I don't like what you're doing here today, do it my way. There's also the principle of legal equality between the states. For example, a small state like Andorra, with 85,000 people and maybe just a few kilometers from side to side, sitting in the Pyrenees Mountains, is legally equal to the United States, to Canada, the UK, China, and Japan. It has just as big a voice, legally speaking. And finally, the treaties required that states respect the borders and the boundaries of other states, that they could not enter those states and intervene in the internal affairs of a state. Well, now what does that mean for us, though, in the cyber world that has essentially no borders? Remember, I used the example of being able to move money earlier. Being able to move money basically at the speed of light. And now we can move data, we can actually do attacks across borders through other nations, going from place to place to place, all very, very rapidly and at almost no cost. How does the Treaty of Westphalia and the foundation of international relations that we have been using for 380 years, how does that affect our cybersecurity? It's an issue that needs to be addressed. You know, I spoke earlier, and I want to go back to a point. James Comey said that there are those that have been attacked and those who don't know that they've been attacked. 69%, according to recent statistics, of victims learn from a third party. That may be a white hat hacker. It could be an IT audit. It could be during an insurance audit. Or it could be a law enforcement entity such as the FBI or the Secret Service, who tells us that we've been breached, that we have a serious problem in our computer systems. More than 2/3 of the entities learn from an outside entity that they have been compromised. They don't even know it themselves. Remember the 4D model? Deter, deny, detect. Their denial systems have obviously failed. Their deterrent systems have obviously failed. But even worse, their detection systems have failed. And because the first three of the 4Ds have failed, they're not able to disrupt until this outside agency tells them. And up until relatively recently, this is a really scary statistic, that those people who were able to breach and get into a system were able to work within that system, the attacked system, undetected for more than 205 days. That is staggering. More than 6 months inside of a system without detection. I will suggest to you that in addition to our deterrence, our denial systems, that we must have better detection systems of anomalies that are occurring within our computer systems. Not just the initial breach, but also when things are happening inside of our system that don't make sense. Now, recently though, studies are showing that we're getting better at this, but still, access to the victim's environments is reduced to only 146 days. Still, 4 or 5 months where someone is, if we were to think about this in the physical world, they've broken into your house, they're living in your house, they're sharing your bed, they're sharing your TV, they're eating your food, using your plumbing, taking showers, and you don't know it for 5 months. That's an amazingly bad statistic that we need to change. I spoke a little bit about the Treaty of Westphalia, but one thing that many of us don't understand and don't realize, in the defense world of today, many of our defense treaties are built for physical attacks, the use of bullets and bombs, air forces, nuclear weapons, and so on. But that's not the kind of attack that can bring our country down these days that we really need to be worried about. The type of attack that we really need to be worried about is cyber attacks. Now think about this. I'll use as an example the mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Philippines. In that treaty, the first few lines spell out that in case of an armed attack, the two parties are required to respond and help each other. I'll submit that in a cyber attack, it is not an armed attack. Therefore, the Philippines is not obligated to help the United States, and the United States is not obligated to help the Philippines, even when their power system, their power grid is crushed, when their cities are dark, when people are dying because they can no longer have electricity powering their breathing systems, their air supplies, and so on. But it's not an armed attack. Therefore, the United States is not obligated to reply. I like one of the things that Ray Kelly, commissioner of the New York City Police Department, said a couple of years ago. Now, he was speaking of terrorism, but I apply this also to the cyber world. He said, we do not think another attack is inevitable, but we do think that they'll try. Our job is to stop them. I like that much, much better than the attitude of, well, we can't do anything. They will attack. An attack is inevitable. Our job is to stop them. And I want to suggest to you that just as in terrorism, that our job is to stop them from a cyber attack that will cripple our companies, cripple our nations. I also want to emphasize again the widespread, worldwide need for cooperation. That may take the way of a mutual legal assistance treaty, but that needs to be updated. That process needs to be updated because we're not talking about physical evidence that can be collected at a crime scene and then packaged and sent across borders. Electronic information, electronic data is perishable. It's easily altered. It must be collected in a way that is legally sound. And our mutual legal assistance treaties just have not kept up with today's world. And I want to suggest that our justice departments, our legal systems, and our courts need to update accordingly. So with that, I want to wrap this day up. We've covered a lot of territory. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you for the last 20 minutes or so, but I've given you much food for thought and for discussion. I appreciate the time to be with you today. I'll be around to answer questions in a few moments.